Thank you so much, Quen, and welcome Professor Dorothy Roberts. And I hope everyone, wherever you are tuning in, is joining me and giving you a raucous and enthusiastic welcome to this virtual event. How are you doing?
I'm doing well and just so excited and so grateful to you, Eve, and to Women and Children First for hosting this. Thanks for taking the time. I'm
Of
just
course.
so thrilled that we'll be in conversation.
Oh, of course, I'm honored to do it. And as we've discussed, I want to open up by inviting you to read a passage from the book, and hopefully we can get into some great conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is read, starting out with a brief story that I tell in the book, and then I'll turn to a passage from the book's introduction. In August 2021, Tyrone Denier, a Black man with a beard and dreadlocks, broadcast on Instagram live video showing armed deputies from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office detaining him, his partner, Saisha Mercado, a former American Idol finalist, and their 10-day-old baby. The deputies had pulled the family's car over to the side of the highway to execute a family court judge's order to seize the couple's newborn daughter. The family's nightmare began in February of that year when Mercado and Denier took their 13-month-old son to a hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, to seek medical care. Pregnant at the time, Mercado was having trouble transitioning the toddler from breastfeeding to eating solid foods and was concerned that he was dehydrated. Hospital staff called the child maltreatment hotline to report that the toddler was malnourished and failing to thrive, and the Department of Children and Families, DCF, took him from his parents. Because Mercado and Denier were under CPS supervision when their daughter was born 6 months later, DCF considered the newborn to be at risk. The couple had hired an attorney to advocate for the return of their son and was embroiled in court proceedings, which led to the judge's pickup order to the sheriff's office. The video Denier posted shows Mercado holding the infant wrapped in a pink blanket as she walks slowly from her car toward 3 white women who appear to be CPS staff, as if she were a condemned convict walking to the gallows. Mercado pauses in front of the workers. "Do you not feel anything?" she asks the women desperately. "You guys, I'm human. This is my baby. My baby is 10 days old and you're taking my baby away from me. You're taking my baby away from me. You have no heart." As Mercado hands over her daughter, she pleads with the women once more. "My baby is healthy and happy. My baby is breastfeeding from me. What are you going to give my baby?" When the child begins to cry, Mercado grows more distraught. "You're traumatizing my baby. You have created so much trauma. I'm not a danger to my baby. It's so wrong. It's so wrong." Then she collapses into Denier's chest, weeping inconsolably. With the help of the viral video, a team of lawyers, and media attention, Mercado and Denier were reunited with their daughter 9 days later while they continued to fight to recover their son. The terror inflicted by the armed officers who surrounded the peaceful family and the cruelty displayed by the CPS workers who tore the infant from her loving mother leave no doubt that the joint incursion was aimed at criminalizing the parents, not protecting their child. Every year, government agents invade the homes of hundreds of thousands of families in poor and low-income communities without a warrant or any other kind of judicial authorization in the name of protecting the children who live there. In 2018 alone, 3.5 million children were involved in an investigation by Child Protective Services. Black families are disproportionately subjected to state intrusion. Caseworkers and police officers inspect the premises for what, in their opinion, constitutes a risk to the children. Based on state child neglect laws, the investigators interpret conditions of poverty, lack of food, insecure housing, and inadequate medical care as evidence of parental unfitness. They also perceive the homes in Black communities as more hazardous for children, even when the alleged parental infraction, like allowing a toddler to momentarily stray away or having bottles of alcohol in the house, happen in white affluent homes too. The parents under investigation rarely know their legal rights and aren't informed of them. Asserting their rights is usually futile. Caseworkers subject family members to humiliating questioning and interrogate children separately and pressure them to make statements against their relatives. During these interrogations, caseworkers inspect children for evidence, sometimes strip searching them. Most Black children in America, and I'll repeat that, most Black children in America will undergo a CPS investigation at some point in their childhoods. This surveillance constitutes the stop and frisk of Black families that falls off the radar of public protest. A child welfare investigation, most allegations prompting a child welfare investigation are for neglect. The vast majority of the families subjected to investigation have low incomes, are living in poverty, and could use some help meeting their material needs. But the government agents who investigate them don't offer the resources struggling families need. Instead, they brandish a terrifying weapon against them, the threat of taking their children away. Every year, the state child protection agencies make good on that threat and remove about 500,000 children from their homes. Officially, these agencies seize about 250,000 children annually, and it's estimated that they take another 250,000 children through informal, coerced arrangements that never make it into official statistics. More than 1 in 10 Black children in America will be forcibly separated from their parents and placed in foster care by the time they reach age 18. Child welfare authorities wield these powers to supervise, reassemble, and destroy families with stunningly little judicial restraint or public scrutiny. Such extreme state intrusion in homes violates well-established principles of US constitutional law that protect us from tyrannical government rule. Such traumatic assaults on people's most cherished relationships targeted against vulnerable populations constitutes torture under international declarations. Such a powerful mechanism for reinforcing racial capitalism, the US system of wealth accumulation grounded in racist hierarchy and ideology, parallels the function of police and prisons. Recent foster care rates for US children at 576 per 100,000 are about the same as incarceration rates for US adults at 582 per 100,000. The child welfare system has unparalleled powers to terrorize entire communities, shape national policies, and reinforce our unjust social order. Yet most Americans have never thought of this form of state violence imposed on oppressed communities as a political injustice. To the contrary, they have been led to believe that the government is saving these communities' children. The state violence inflicted in the name of child protection is a benevolent terror. The abolitionist mission to liberate Black people from captivity must include freeing family caregivers from state supervision and children from foster care. Ultimately, movements to dismantle different parts of the carceral state are working toward the same world, a world where all children are safe and cared for without the need for police, prisons, and family separation. A more expansive understanding of policing and abolition that contests the state's benevolent terror is essential to collectively building a new society that supports rather than destroys families and communities. This book is dedicated to that abolitionist vision. So I'll end there and look forward to our conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Dorothy. I really appreciate it. And for those that are already starting to think and percolate with ideas and questions based on what we just heard, please know that throughout our conversation, you can share your questions and comments in the Q&A, and we will have some time at the end of our virtual convening to hear those questions. So before I ask my questions, I'm a big believer in giving flowers, and every time I see you, I try to give you your flowers, but I don't think you can really do it enough. So I'm gonna, if you'll forgive me, I'm gonna do it again. And I just want to say, every opportunity I get, how grateful I am personally for your scholarship and how important your work has been for me as a Black feminist scholar, and your boldness and your courage, which is so much on display in this book, just means a lot to me and to so many people. So thank you.
Thanks.
Really grateful.
That means a lot to me, and I so admire your bold visionary scholarship as well. So it's mutual.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, one challenge when you try to do bold visionary scholarship is, that people challenge you, right? And so, in the book, as you just shared with us, you argue that the child welfare system, as it's referred to, should actually be understood as the family policing system. And that suggests that those of us who see ourselves as critical of the institution of policing should extend that criticality to this institution. And I wonder, how, to what degree you find that idea has been met with resistance because of this perception that this is a benevolent system compared to the other arenas in which, because you've done, work in so many different arenas. So do you find that there's more resistance to this idea, and why do you think that is?
So I think that there is a general resistance to the idea of abolishing this system for fear that children won't be protected, will be left to abusive family members if the system doesn't exist. And that's true across the board, not just among abolitionists. I think with prison abolitionists, it's not so much resistance as not having thought about the so-called child welfare system in the same political terms that they think about prisons and criminal law enforcement, or the police. Well, we usually think of police, although there's a slogan going on among us abolitionists that caseworkers are also cops. And as I point out in the book and in the story I told, they work hand in hand with cops all the time. But I think there is a general lack of understanding of this system as a political institution that helps to uphold white supremacy and racial capitalism in America. And there's been such a powerful and persuasive kind of propaganda around it that it actually does help children and families, and that or even when people are aware that it has its flaws, that and that their children, the children aren't treated as well as they might be, there's still a sense that there's some need for it.
Right.
And so, it's curious why that is. I think, as I said, part of it is that it's lack of knowledge about it. I think people are more familiar with the prison system and police than they are with the child welfare system. So that's a piece of it. But I think part of it also is a deep-seated idea that we really have to work on contesting, that Black mothers aren't always capable of taking care of their children.
Right.
And I found that is an idea that I've encountered it in so much of the work that I do, including reproductive justice work.
Yes.
And from so many people, this idea that you can't really leave families under the authority of Black mothers. And and you can, even as I say that, I'm sure you could think of all the kinds of factions.
Everyone who comes together around that idea.
Yes.
They don't agree on anything else, but they can all agree on unfit Black mothers.
Yes, yes. And so I think that's part of it as well, that we need as movement people to think about. So all of those come together. And I don't want to say so much as an affirmative resistance to this idea as a failure to embrace it. That I found. I also was very worried during the uprisings that were going on a couple summers ago, that and calls to defund the police, that I heard from the mouths of prison and police abolitionists that the money should be diverted from prisons and police departments into departments of human services, either explicitly or implying that the money should go to child protective services. And there I thought it was probably just a failure to understand and to have analyzed how the system operates, just like police departments. And again, police departments and child welfare agencies rely on each other in really deep ways, not just the obvious way of how caseworkers frequently call police officers to go with them to search homes and investigate families, especially in Black neighborhoods, but also more at a political level where police officers gain a lot of power. I mean, this may seem counterintuitive, but they actually gain power by associating themselves with child protection. They go into homes without a warrant routinely, because it's not, many judges don't apply the Fourth Amendment to caseworkers, even though it applies to them. But caseworkers rarely show up with a warrant. They don't go to court first and can show probable cause to search a home. So when they bring police with them, the police get a free pass. Go in with them.
Get whatever else they may see or be able to plant or do, or
Absolutely. And so, and then conversely, the caseworkers have this armed force that can back them up to terrorize families. So they work together in a way that expands the surveillance of Black communities, exponentially, without the kinds of, what should be constitutional restraints. Of course, we know that they don't always apply either in the case of police, but at least there's an expectation that they're supposed to. There's not even that expectation in the case of child protection. So it's as if it gives the state the power to investigate and surveil and punish and control and disrupt Black communities without having to go through the bother of convicting anybody of a crime.
Right.
And a lot of this is based on people's suspicions, mandated reporters' suspicions, anonymous calls to a child abuse hotline. It lacks even the protections you would expect in a criminal case, but can have just as devastating consequences and end up with police collecting
attached criminal cases.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hearing you talk about this and thinking about this book and its relationship to your earlier book, Shattered Bonds, one of the things that strikes me in thinking about this question of why doesn't this get more attention? There's such a contrast between what you rightly point out as people's lack of analysis of this issue, contrasted with the absolute ubiquity of these experiences in the lives of Black women, right? And it just strikes me that part of this is also just a lack of willingness to take up the continued lack of willingness to take up the everyday experiences of Black women, particularly of poor Black women. And I frankly, I read and write about a lot of really awful and challenging things, and this is one of the hardest books for me to read, just because I think about so many things, and I one of my earliest memories of kindergarten is of being on my way to school, feeling fine, and when I got to school, I got sick, and saying I'm sick, and being taken by a social worker into the office, and the first thing she asked me was, well, why did your mother send you to school if you were sick? And I remember being 5 and knowing at 5, like, this is an illogical question. Obviously, I wasn't sick when I left my house, right? But now I am. And I remember this kind of questioning, and I remember my mother telling me, you can't tell people things like that because they will take you away from me, right?
Yeah.
And this is the single Black mom in the 90s. And so
Yeah.
it really drives home the way that, the importance of this work that's really focusing on these lived experiences. And I wonder how you think we can push people from focusing on just specific institutions. Hospitals over here, hospitals are racist, schools are racist, prisons
Yeah.
are racist, all of
Yeah.
which is true. But you're really pushing us to understand in a punitive anti-Black culture,
Yeah.
right? And how do we get people to this broader kind of culture of punishment analysis?
Yeah, yeah. Well, first, I want to absolutely say I think you're on the right track when you point out that these are common experiences of Black mothers, especially in, impoverished, segregated Black neighborhoods. This is one of the points I make in the book, is that in those neighborhoods, everybody knows
Right.
about the system.
And you focus on Woodlawn for those who haven't read the book
Woodlawn,
yet.
exactly. I did a small study in Woodlawn, and they called DCFS the system. Now, which indicates that was the most present state system
Right.
in their lives, and everybody was familiar with it, whether they had been entangled with it or not. They had some relationship to it. So and I also find this, when I talk to people about this subject, if they've done research having to do with the criminal legal system, or with poverty, or or racism in other contexts, they'll say, "Oh, you know what? One of the people I talked to did tell me about that experience." So it's there, and I think you're right that the failure not only of people in racial justice movements, but also in academia, sociology. Why isn't this a big topic in sociology or political science? It isn't at all. And it's starting to be with junior scholars now, but it hasn't been for a long time. And I do think it has something to do with the devaluation of the people it affects most, and so I think you're right about that. Also, yeah, so in what I focus on in terms of the way in which these carceral approaches are entangled, by looking at how the family policing system and the criminal legal system are so entangled, you start to see that it is one, I call it a carceral web, but you pointed out anti-Black culture. It's one apparatus. It's one way of thinking that draws in all of these different kinds of systems that do work hand in hand. I've already talked about how family policing and criminal law enforcement, the criminal legal system, are so not only parallel, but just intimately entangled. But the healthcare system, the schools, and social services in general, they all are filled with so-called mandated reporters who become agents of the state to help to investigate families and remove Black children from their homes. And so by focusing on this one system, it becomes very obvious that they are working together, and that we really can't understand how any one of them operates without thinking about it as a coherent way in which Black communities are patrolled and punished and controlled and disenfranchised in America. So how do we get people to see that? Well, I'm hoping that through partly an analysis, partly telling people narratives and stories that and people who've experienced it, explaining how all of these different systems were involved in the violence that they experienced, that I think it's both sharing knowledge about it, but also having an analysis of how they work together. And another important aspect of it, I think, is when we start to think about, well, what would replace what we have now? I think the vision of what would replace it is so similar in, among the movements that are dismantling different pieces of this carceral web. So, even in the small ending of the passage that I read, I made the point that I think prison abolitionists and family policing abolitionists are working toward the same society where we meet human needs and resolve social conflicts, including violent conflicts, not by these carceral, punitive, terroristic means that exist in these systems now, but through means of genuine caring and support for people, and actually meeting human people's
Right.
material needs, and preventing violence instead of reacting in punitive ways after it's already occurred. I think when we start to think about what we need to be working on and are working on to replace what we have now, we see that we really do need to be working together on a common mission, and that what we're envisioning is the same kind of society.
Mhm. And that question of care over punishment is so paramount in that. And
Yes.
I appreciate what you said about having the compelling analysis, and you are such a powerful storyteller. And even the example that you used to frame the beginning of our conversation, we see how the healthcare system is implicated,
Yes.
which you and many others have done incredible work on this issue of racism in medicine. And it's ironic and terrifying to hear you read that passage in the context of the moment we're in now, where there's this national formula shortage, right? And how
Yes.
many people I hope are thinking, oh, but for the grace of God, that we need to have this solidarity, because
Yes.
this is a kind of precarity that so many people are experiencing.
Yes. Yes. And if I mean, and I'm glad you raised that, because it just shows that that children's needs go unmet in America, not
Every day.
every day. And it's
Right.
not because their parents don't care about them or are
Right.
neglectful. It's because we live in a society that not only doesn't provide the material resources people need to meet children's needs, but affirmatively blocks them
Yes.
from getting those resources. And we can see that it would be so easy to provide, but we have a capitalistic system. This is just so apparent with this infant formula shortage, where the answer is, oh, how do we get these companies to to be able to have a profit manufacturing formula again, instead of just having a society that provides the formula that children need. And so it highlights, I think, the way in which the family policing system operates to divert our attention away from the kind of society we should have that actually provides these are minimal needs. This is what babies need to survive. We're not even talking about anything extravagant or luxurious. It's just minimal basic needs. And it highlights how it's our social structure that prevents children from having their needs met, and the way in which this whole notion of accusing family caregivers and blaming them for child neglect and taking their children away from, as a solution, is just inflicting violence on them, not at all doing anything to meet the needs of children and families. And if anything, is a barrier to it. That's why I say we have to dismantle this system while we're replacing it with another approach that truly does meet children's needs, because it's an affirmative barrier
Yes.
to creating those approaches. People think that they have to rely on this brutal, terroristic, abusive system. And, it's not only abusing children who are taken from their homes, which by itself is traumatizing. We during the Trump administration, there was all this research coming out about how
Right.
traumatizing it is to children to take them from their parents and how this is a form of torture and how it violates UN conventions. Well, this goes on every day in Black neighborhoods, and that trauma isn't recognized by people in power making these policies. And so, but it's not just that; it's also the majority of children whose needs aren't met in America don't even come under the radar of the child welfare system. So it already is traumatizing and disrupting far too many families. But at the same time, it's not even addressing at all. It's not even
Right.
paying attention to the vast majority of children who have unmet needs because of our really bankrupt, well, that's probably not a good term because it's a wealthy
Morally
nation,
bereft.
but
Yes.
morally bankrupt,
Yes.
but wealthy nation.
And that's one of the ways in which that's another parallel to policing, in the sense that people say, well, who's going to solve the murders? And it's like, well, if you've ever called the police to try to get help for something, or if you've ever looked at the homicide clearance rate in Chicago, right, you realize that we are living the fear-based image of benign neglect that is held over as a threat is the situation in which we already live,
Yeah,
in which we are not, these systems are not taking care of us.
right. Yeah. So, and an example of that is the most of the time when you hear about the child welfare system, it is based on this fear that something terrible is going to happen to children if families aren't being surveilled and investigated and children aren't being removed from their homes. And so you hear the story when a child is killed in the home, and it's usually because the reason why it's newsworthy is because it's a child known to the system.
Right.
And then there's all this hand wringing about, well,
Why
why
weren't they checked on more? And
why weren't they checked on more? And the response then isn't, obviously this system is failing to protect children. The response is, oh, we need to invest more money into this system. We need to put more caseworkers on the job. We need to investigate more families. And in fact, there's studies that show that that's just what happens. There's this intensive uptick in investigations and child removals, and all that does is overload the system, and it doesn't solve the problem. But we already know that the systems that remove the most children aren't the ones that keep children the safest. And not to mention all the harms that happen to children after they're removed from their homes and put into a so-called foster care system that has abysmal outcomes for children.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have more questions for you. Just a quick reminder for those listening in that you can put your questions for Professor Roberts in the chat, and I will cede the floor to our audience in a couple of minutes. But a moment ago, you mentioned that, which something you also bring up in the book, which is the absolutely justified and necessary outrage that we saw about family, that we continue to see around the issue of family separation at the border.
Yes.
And which disproportionately impacts people from countries that have been impacted by global US colonialism, right?
Yes.
And empire. And you also talk quite a bit about Native families in the book,
Yeah.
which are the other subset of communities which are deeply surveilled and have very high rates of child removal and family separation. Where do you see possibilities for radical solidarity in this issue from communities that maybe are not always talking to each other or seeing these as the same issues, and specifically around women of color?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think seeing that we're talking about, again, a coherent tactic of family separation as a form of state violence that has historically been used to oppress communities, to tamp down rebellions against the US state, to have greater control, even to decimate communities, as in the case of indigenous people, where child removal was initially a military strategy used as a weapon of war during the so-called Indian Wars, and then later on became a strategy, official strategy of the US government to end the cultures of Native people by taking their children and having them adopted by white families who were supposed to change their culture, remove their culture from them.
And by the way, Native parents who bought this could be arrested, in prison, and this was the law. Yeah,
absolutely. And and again, we can see this in the case of Black people and Native people as a form of backlash or a way of ending rebellions and other kinds of resistance. I mean, it's very clear politically that whether we're talking about rebellions by enslaved people or the white supremacist backlash after the Civil War and the effort to re-enslave Black people, or during the Civil Rights Movement. In each of these historic periods, you can see how family separation targeted at Black people is a way of the US state to quell, to try to quell resistance against white supremacy. So I think if we think about how child removal is used in that way and how it brings together why it is that Black children, Native children, children at the border are the ones that are being removed at these high rates, that historical analysis and that political analysis can help us see how we are being, we are suffering from and survivors of a common tactic by the US government, and this is a global issue as well, by states to target marginalized communities, disenfranchised communities within the nation. And so to me, that should be a reason and a foundation for coming together, to seeing that these aren't individualized attacks. This is a coherent strategy of US imperialism and white supremacy against our communities. That to me is a reason to join together. And there are examples of that happening. I think we need more of it, but I think as our movements today against family policing become stronger and more well-known, I think we'll see those kinds of collaborations increasing. And collaborations among people who are suffering from and resisting family policing, but also then along with the prison abolition movement, or the movement to abolish the prison industrial complex. I mean, that is really powerful when we start to see how the oppressions that we're fighting against are connected, but also the values that we have and the world that we're trying to build is a common vision.
Yes, I really appreciate you saying that. And I think that sometimes, because we have this model that we're fighting for scarce resources, scarce attention, that when we make these kinds of comparisons, the first instinct that folks have is to kind of figure out, well, who has it worse, and to jockey for attention, instead of thinking, let's use this point of comparison as a basis for shared building. And I think, one of the, anytime you're doing any abolitionist work, people ask, what are we going to replace it with? And you have started to nod towards that. But before we get to that question, I want to take a step behind that and think about this question of reform. And that the people will say, like, well, can the system be reformed? What are some reforms that we can use? And you very eloquently outline the many, many, many ways that you were and have been involved in serious reform efforts since the release of Shattered Bonds. And I wonder if you could, certainly you can't take us through all of them, but just talk briefly about some of those efforts and how you arrived at where you are now, which is this very robust abolitionist framework.
Yeah. Part of the reason why I am so sure that we need to abolish the system is because I've spent so much time trying to reform it and see that it cannot possibly be reformed when the foundational logic of it, the idea that the way to protect children is to investigate their families, supervise their families, and threaten to take their children away, remains. And through all the kinds of reforms I've been involved in, that fundamental approach stays.
Yeah.
So the reforms have been, and I'll give two examples of the kinds of reforms that are very popular and that I've been involved in, and I can see why they don't work. So one is, well, the problem is racial, so-called now racial disproportionality. That the
We need
rate
to remove all children at the same rate.
exactly. If we could just remove, shrink the disproportionality. No one actually believes that it would be possible to equalize it because people deeply believe that Black parents aren't, they're
Right.
not as fit as white parents. So, even in these reform efforts, it's just let's shrink the disproportionality and yes, try to take similar shares of Black and white Native children, and others away from their families. But still, the fundamental idea that the threat of taking children away is, you must rely on that is
Right.
there. So that's one. And then the other is to increase services and reduce child removal. But again, still within the system that is coercive, that's threatening, and that always has the threat out there that if you don't comply, though, with these forced services, we'll take your children away from you. And so just to give, so I participated in so many efforts to reduce racial disproportionality. I mean, even, my participation was to point out how gross this and obvious the racism of it was, but working with people who just wanted to shrink the numbers, I never thought that that was going to really make the kind of difference that I wanted to make. The other was a big class action lawsuit that I participated in for 9 years, where I was one of 5 experts that after a judge found that the state of Washington was violating the constitutional rights of children in foster care, I was appointed with 4 other people to produce this plan that was going to, supposed to get the state of Washington to treat children in foster care better. And I could see right away that the whole approach was not to end foster care, not to reunite children with their families. When I suggested that, people just weren't interested at all. So for example, I thought that the parents and family caregivers of these children should be a big part of this, and no one was interested in involving them at all. The people they were most concerned about were the foster parents, the foster caretakers, and making sure they were being trained better, and had better resources and were paid better. And with no thought to fundamentally change anything. The idea was that the system is basically good, but we just need to correct these flaws through training, through lower caseloads, through making efforts to get children the kind of healthcare they needed, and trying to keep children from running away. And that was, the runaways was a problem that we could never solve. And I kept saying, why are children running away from foster care? There's a reason they're running away. It's a bad place for them to be. That's why they're running away. We're not going to solve it.
They want to be with their parents. They want to be with their guardians, right?
Exactly. And many of them do run away to try to find their families, or they would prefer to live in the street than to go back to the kind of care, so-called care they were getting. That would suggest to people that something is drastically wrong with this system, and that it's not caring for children, that it's not protecting them, it's not keeping them safe. And the response in Washington and many other places is to call the police on these children, and the children end up in juvenile detention or jail. And it makes their, it devastates their lives. It doesn't help them at all. It's a farce to say that this is a system that is designed to protect them. So, and after all of that, it was just very clear to me, along with learning more about abolition. I'm so grateful to the prison abolition movement for its principles and its organizing. It changed. Learning more about it changed the way I thought about what had to be done with the system, and I could understand better. It has to be completely dismantled, and at the same time, though, it's just as important to building a replacement for it as we're dismantling piece by piece this destructive system that exists now.
Well, thank you so much. And there's a question that I had, but we'll segue to the audience because there are several people in the audience who have this question as well. And I'm sure it's going to be a fairly obvious one that you've been asked a lot, which is this question of mandated reporting, right? And so I'm a mandated reporter. I was a mandated reporter as a public school teacher. I'm a mandated reporter now as a professor at a social work school. And in many states, including Illinois, if you can actually be prosecuted as a mandated reporter who doesn't report. And so folks in the audience are curious to know, how should we think about this? Are there ways to kind of reduce, do we think about this as a harm reduction strategy, or what can we do? And also, what are other ways that people can think about addressing in the same way we're thinking about what can I do instead of calling the police?
Yeah, right.
People are interested to know what can they do instead of calling in Chicago, DCFS or Child Protective Services.
Yeah. So first of all, my bottom line is we should not have mandated reporting. I think that it's harmful because it encourages people, especially if they think they're going to be prosecuted if they don't report. It encourages people, number one, to report suspicions to CPS, which can lead to traumatizing children, separating from their families, and not
even from the investigation, as you write.
Even from the investigation, and these investigations involve strangers coming into your home, sometimes, as I said, with armed police officers, looking through every corner of the house, investigating and interrogating children apart from their parents, sometimes strip searching children, looking for evidence. And, we haven't had time to talk about it, but the surveillance, the invasion into people's private lives, and the totalizing kind of surveillance, looking into their records, school records, hospital records, criminal records, and now expanded by many child welfare departments, including in Chicago, hiring computer companies to amass huge amounts of data and use algorithms and other kinds of predictive analytics to identify who's at risk. The same kinds of predictive analytics that police departments are using, which is subject to racial bias and just reproducing the kinds of racist data that goes into it, producing those kinds of unequal outcomes. So the investigation that can come from a report is itself harmful. It rarely results in the child or the family getting the resources that are, that they need, and can result in terrible harms. And so the idea that people who see that a child has needs, that they believe that their reaction should be to call CPS is harmful. They should have the freedom in their professional judgment. These are supposed to be professionals who care for children. That's who mandated reporters are. So in their professional judgment, they should be able to have a whole repertoire of services and aids and resources that they can give to children and families without thinking that their go-to is to call a child abuse hotline. It getting rid of mandated reporting doesn't limit anybody. It gives them greater freedom. And because of mandated reporting, there are many people who would otherwise have met the needs or helped to meet the needs of children, but instead think that the solution is calling the hotline. And then there are many families that are deterred from seeking help from teachers, from doctors, from social service providers, because they're afraid they're going to turn them in to CPS. And this doesn't mean, some people say, well, if they are not doing anything, why are wrong? Why are they afraid? Because they know, they've seen that CPS has taken children from families that are loving and caring and haven't done anything wrong, just have needs.
Have mice in the apartment.
Have mice in
right,
the,
right.
yes, absolutely. And so it's a deterrent. It's an overall deterrent to schools and clinics and community programs being able to support families instead of being agents of, deputized agents of the state to turn families in. And the other thing I would say is it is simply a lie that mandated reporting requires people to turn in report any child they suspect, because they don't do it in the case of wealthy white families. So people have discretion. We absolutely know from, just from common sense and experience, but also documented in multiple studies, that doctors and teachers and caseworkers and others are far more likely to suspect and to report Black parents of child abuse and neglect than white parents, especially if they're middle class or affluent, in the case of the same injuries, in the case of the same behavior. A good example is substance use or suspicion of substance use. We know perfectly well that wealthy white families also have substance abuse in their homes. And it is very rare that they have their children taken from them, even when doctors and therapists and teachers know about it.
Mm-hmm.
I point out in the book, just read a memoir of a wealthy white person.
Right.
And
right.
you read about half the time all sorts of neglect and abuse that was going on in the home. Children who have severe disorders, let's say an eating disorder, for example, they're not going to be reported, the parents, for not providing adequate medical care for their children, or traumatizing their children, or emotional abuse, or all the kinds of grounds that are used against impoverished Black parents. They are going to rely on private means.
Mm-hmm.
And this is part of the injustice of the system, which is, this is not to say that there aren't problems in families. There are problems in families across the board, but the difference is that we have a system that deals with the problems of poor Black families through terror and family destruction. And we have a system that deals with the problems of wealthy white families through private, more caring means. That is a grave injustice. And let's be honest, that's what this system is about. Mandated reporters serve as reporters of the state system that targets impoverished communities, especially Black and Native communities. That's what they're mandated to do. They're not really mandated to report any suspicion of harm. It's only suspicion of harm in certain communities. So that's not true universal mandated reporting. Now, if we're going to be honest about it, then we should admit that it's targeted at certain groups and that that's unjust. You know, all that you could say abolition is asking for is to treat the marginalized communities the way that you would treat children from more privileged communities, which is to provide the resources that they need. Those families are able to meet their children's needs. They're able to rely on, a fancy drug treatment program voluntarily. They're able to get the benefit of the doubt when a child is injured. That the system is not one that is designed to universally protect children. It's designed to police the most marginalized families in the nation for political reasons. And mandated reporters work for that system. Now, what do you do? As I said, I'm not saying that there aren't needs, unmet needs in many families, but reporting them to a system that's not going to meet their needs isn't the answer. But we do have to have other ways, other resources, other mutual aid networks, community-based resources that people who now are mandated reporters, professionals who engage with children can turn to when they see children in need. And that's what we need to build up. That's one of the reasons why I say dismantling the family policing system has to happen at the same time as building up these replacements for it. Not incrementally, not just in terms of this vision we have in the distant future,
but now, today, every day.
Now, today, by having these replacements for it present right now, it gives people who are concerned about a family in need another way they can address the needs. They can help by turning to those resources instead of feeling that they have no choice but to call the child abuse hotline, because they'll have someplace else that they can see is better, less violent, more caring for families, and more effective at preventing the need, meeting the needs of preventing violence in the home.
Well, my last question builds directly off of that and is a kind of synthesis of two questions that we have from the audience. And I hope that everyone watching will accept my sincerest and most true, profound apologies if you asked a wonderful question and we didn't get to it, because there were so many. So please accept my apologies. But there are a couple of folks who are just interested in us ending on that note of building. And so one person, for example, has asked, are there places where Black people are building other kinds of social service organizations that are culturally relevant, culturally responsive? Another viewer is asking, how do we build capacity, and looking at transformative justice as a model, what kind of capacity building we can be doing in this space. And this person wants to know, how can we invest on that level? So I wonder if you could close us out by maybe if there are a couple organizations or ideas that you want to uplift, where can we show up and support right now?
Sure. So I'll mention a few organizations that have websites. So you can go to the websites and there are resources there.
And maybe Quen can help us out by putting some of them in the chat.
Okay, here we go. So number one, have to mention Jmac for Families in New York City, which was founded and is directed by Joyce McMillan, a Black woman whose own children were taken from her based on an anonymous tip to the child abuse hotline in New York City that she used drugs recreationally. And she is a fierce organizer. She has a whole legislative plan that she's working on. So one thing we can do is support legislation that reduces the power of these systems. And so you can go to her website to learn more about that and about the legislation that's pending in New York, but there's similar legislation pending in other parts of the country as well. There's Movement for Family Power, which is also a New York City organization, founded and led by Lisa Sangoy and Aaron Cloud. And they have lots of information on their website about various kinds of actions taking place, and mutual aid networks, and other ways that you can both work on dismantling the system, but also building up these replacements for it that truly care for children and support families. There's an organization called the Upend Movement, which is based in University of Houston College of Social Work and the Center for the Study of Social Policy, that is a great resource for webinars and other reports and other kind of information about abolishing family policing. There's a National Coalition for Child Protection Reform. I have been a longtime board member. Our director, Richard Wexler, is just a fount of information. So information about family policing. So if you just want to learn more about family policing, you could go on that website. And let me also point out, for those who are maybe law students or lawyers, that there is a growing practice called family defense. And these are usually units in legal services offices, like the Bronx Defenders and Brooklyn Defenders, Harlem Legal Services, Community Legal Services in Philadelphia. Most cities have a legal services office, and many of them now have family defense units. They're increasingly multidisciplinary, so they include not only lawyers, but also social workers and parent peer advocates. And it's a place where I think if you're, a lawyer, a law student, or in social work, or someone who's been impacted by this system and wants to be an advocate, that is a place where you can explore opportunities to work. Oh, let me mention one other, Rise magazine in New York City. Rise is a longstanding magazine that published the voices of family caregivers whose children have been taken from them, and is now led by two women of color, and they are abolitionist and have developed parent leadership programs, and also are working on networks of parents who can support each other in order to stay apart from this destructive system.
Wow, thank you so much for all those resources. And we have dutifully put them all in the chat and dropped lots of websites. And I also want to just share for folks that, if you get a chance to get into the book, which I didn't do my show and tell, but here it is, that as we've discussed here, it becomes so clear how all these other systems, we didn't even get into housing, right? Which is a huge way in which that you talk about people, housing, medical care, not having adequate child care to go, to look for a job, or, things like that. And so I hope that people will support all of these organizations, but also understand that all the other transformative capacity building that we're doing in these areas to help folks get food, to help people get mental health care and peer support if they're stressed, depressed, right? Those are things that also can lead to abusive situations, to help people find stable housing and stable employment, that, and reliable, safe childcare, transportation, all of those things also contribute to a system in which children can be truly safe.
That's
That's also
such a good
important.
point. Such a good point, Eve. Just even if we look at housing, working for affordable housing in a city, there's studies that show that up to a third of children in foster care now could be safely returned to their families if their families only had secure housing. And so, yeah, and all the others you mentioned as well. There are just so many ways that we can work on replacing this destructive system with approaches, that provide for human needs and solve, get to the root of why there is violence in families. And all of this works together to build a society that's safer for children and that truly supports their well-being. So that's what we're working toward.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for your incredible advocacy as a writer and as an educator, and everything that you've done to bring this analysis in a way that is clear, that is compelling, that is memorable, is deeply moving and affecting. And so I hope that folks will check out this book, Torn Apart, by the amazing scholar, sociologist, legal scholar, and brilliant person, advocate, and activist, Professor Dorothy Roberts. And please join me in a momentous round of applause wherever you may be. And I hope that you will join us again in Chicago, virtually or in person. I think we're going to welcome back our friend Sarah from Women and Children First to say farewell to us.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Eve.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed this. I can't thank you enough.
All the honor's all mine. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your brilliance. That was an incredible conversation, and I know we only covered a part of so much of this incredible, necessary book. So please do order a copy and hold on to those amazing questions that we didn't quite get to, and maybe you'll get them answered in the book.
Yes,
So
there we go.
thank you so much to Eve L. Ewing, Dorothy Roberts, and all of you for joining us. If you know anyone who couldn't join us tonight, don't worry. The recording will be on our YouTube channel very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Eve. Thanks, Women and Children First. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.